She stood in a Texas pond at 2 a.m., designer boots sinking into mud, frantically probing the water with a stick. Former beauty queen, registered nurse, wife, murderer. Darlene Gentry thought she'd committed the perfect crime. She'd planned every detail with the precision her nursing training taught her. Latex gloves to avoid fingerprints, a .22 caliber weapon for minimal mess, a staged home invasion to explain the body. But Darlene made one catastrophic psychological error that would destroy her entire plan. She believed her intelligence made her invisible to science. She was wrong. And the moment she realized it was caught on infrared surveillance footage that would become the centerpiece of her murder conviction. I'm a forensic psychologist, and I've spent 2 years analyzing this case. What fascinates me isn't the murder itself, it's the psychology of a killer so narcissistic she couldn't see the obvious trap police set for her. Because Darlene Gentry didn't just kill her husband, she performed for an audience that was recording everything. Let me show you how narcissism and amateur forensics created one of the most bizarre murder convictions in Texas history. November 9th, 2005, 6:11 a.m., Robinson, Texas. A 911 call comes in from Darlene Gentry reporting a home invasion. Her husband Pete has been shot. She's hysterical on the phone, or at least she's performing hysteria with the skill of someone who's rehearsed the moment. When police arrive at the Gentry home, they find Keith Gentry in bed, dying from a single gunshot wound to the head. The back door is standing open, a gun cabinet has been disturbed, and Darlene Gentry is telling a story about hearing a noise, finding her husband shot, and the intruder fleeing. But here's what the first responding officer noticed within 7 minutes. There was no forced entry on that back door. Nothing of value had been stolen from the home, despite an open gun cabinet. And Darlene Gentry, standing in a room where her husband was bleeding to death, was more concerned about how she looked than whether he was getting help. That last detail, the inappropriate emotional response, that's what triggered the detective's instinct that something was fundamentally wrong with this scene. Darlene Gentry was a study in contradictions that morning. She was a former beauty queen, someone who'd spent years learning to perform under pressure, to maintain composure when being judged. She was also a registered nurse with years of medical training, someone who should have been providing emergency care to her dying husband. Instead, she stood perfectly composed, dry-eyed, focused on her appearance while Keith died. That's not shock, that's not trauma, that's narcissistic detachment, and experienced homicide investigators recognize it immediately. The crime scene itself was strange. Keith had been shot once with a .22 caliber weapon while lying in bed. A small caliber weapon is significant. It suggests someone who wanted to minimize noise and mess. The shot was to the head, suggesting intent to kill rather than wound. The positioning suggested Keith had been asleep when shot, meaning no struggle, no defense, no warning. This wasn't a crime of passion, this was execution. But the staged home invasion, the open back door, the disturbed gun cabinet, it was amateur hour. Detectives could tell within minutes that nothing about the scene matched an actual break-in. But knowing a scene is staged and proving who staged it are different challenges. Police needed evidence, and Darlene, despite her nursing background and her belief that she understood forensic science, was about to hand it to them. Because narcissists make a specific type of mistake. They overestimate their own cleverness while underestimating everyone else's. Darlene thought she knew enough about crime scene investigation to fool police. She didn't know enough to realize what she didn't know, and that gap between perceived competence and actual competence is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it destroys criminals. The first major evidence came from the kitchen.
Investigators found a pair of latex gloves in the trash can. Now, finding latex gloves in a nurse's home isn't unusual. Darlene would have had medical supplies around. But these gloves contained something that destroyed her entire defense. Inside the gloves, where her hands would have been, was Darlene's DNA. On the outside of the gloves was Keith's blood. And inside one of the gloves was a spent .22 caliber shell casing. Let me explain why this is catastrophically incriminating from a forensic perspective. Darlene wore these gloves while shooting Keith. The shell casing ejected from the weapon and, in the chaos of the moment, landed inside the gloves she was wearing. She didn't notice. She took the gloves off, found the casing inside, and instead of disposing of it properly, she left both gloves and casing in her kitchen trash. For a nurse who presumably understood contamination and evidence, this is a staggeringly stupid mistake. But it's consistent with narcissistic psychology. She was so focused on the performance of being the grieving widow that she didn't carefully dispose of the actual evidence. The gloves gave police physical evidence tying Darlene to the shooting, but they still had a problem: no murder weapon. The .22 caliber gun used to kill Keith was missing. Without the weapon, the defense could argue someone else shot Keith, and Darlene simply handled his body afterward, explaining the blood on her gloves. Police needed that gun, and they were about to use Darlene's own psychology against her to find it. Investigators learned that Darlene had been looking at real estate. Specifically, she'd shown interest in a property with a large pond on it. She'd asked the landowner specifically whether the pond would remain full if she bought the property. This was odd enough to catch attention, but what made it damning was the timing. She'd expressed this interest shortly after Keith's murder. Police developed a theory. Darlene had disposed of the murder weapon in a body of water, and she was concerned about that water being drained and the gun being discovered. So they set a trap. They had the landowner call Darlene and tell her he was planning to drain the pond for maintenance work. Then they waited, and they watched, because they'd set up surveillance cameras focused on that pond. If Darlene had nothing to hide, she'd have no reason to care about pond drainage. But if that pond contained evidence she desperately needed to remain hidden, she'd have to act. And narcissists, when threatened, always act. They can't help themselves. November 11th, 2005, 2 days after Keith's murder, 2 a.m., infrared surveillance cameras captured Darlene Gentry arriving at the property. She's wearing boots and carrying a long stick, and for the next 40 minutes, she wades through that pond, systematically probing the bottom, searching for something. The footage is damning not because it shows her finding the gun. She doesn't. It's damning because it shows her looking for it. It demonstrates consciousness of guilt. It proves she knew there was evidence in that pond that could connect her to Keith's murder. From a forensic psychology perspective, this moment is where Darlene's narcissism completely destroyed her. A rational person, even a guilty one, would have recognized the landowner's call as potentially suspicious, would have considered that police might be watching, would have stayed away from that pond because the risk of being caught searching for evidence was higher than the risk of the gun being found during routine drainage. But Darlene's narcissism convinced her she was smarter than the police. She thought she could retrieve the weapon without being noticed. She didn't consider that the call itself might be a trap. She couldn't imagine that investigators had predicted her exact response. That's not stupidity, that's pathological overconfidence in her own abilities. The surveillance footage of Darlene searching the pond became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Combined with the latex gloves containing her DNA and Keith's blood, the evidence was overwhelming. But what really convicted Darlene Gentry wasn't just the physical evidence, it was the psychological profile the evidence revealed. She'd planned a murder with enough sophistication to use gloves and stage a scene, but she'd executed it with such amateurish mistakes that she'd left a trail a first-year criminology student could follow. That combination, sophisticated planning meeting incompetent execution, is the hallmark of narcissistic criminals who overestimate their own intelligence. The motive emerged during the investigation. Keith Gentry had discovered Darlene's spending habits were out of control. She'd been living a lifestyle they couldn't afford, maintaining the appearance of success and beauty that her pageant background had taught her was essential. Keith had confronted her about the debt. He'd threatened to leave. For Darlene, this wasn't just a marriage problem. It was an existential threat to her identity. She'd built her entire self-concept around being the beautiful, successful, admired woman. Keith leaving would shatter that image. She couldn't tolerate that, so she eliminated the problem. This is classic narcissistic psychology under threat. When a narcissist's carefully constructed self-image is threatened, they don't respond with self-reflection or compromise. They respond with rage and elimination of the threat. Keith wasn't a person to Darlene. He was an obstacle to maintaining her false self, and obstacles in the narcissistic mind must be removed. The fact that this obstacle was a human being she'd married, that removing him meant murder, that the consequences would be catastrophic, none of that registered against the overwhelming need to protect her image. The trial revealed more disturbing details. Darlene had researched Keith's life insurance policy before the murder. She'd made inquiries about what would happen to their home if he died. She'd positioned herself financially to benefit from his death. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was calculated, premeditated murder driven by financial desperation and narcissistic image protection. Darlene had decided Keith was worth to her dead than alive, and she'd acted on that calculation with the cold logic of someone who'd completely dehumanized her victim. But where her planning was cold and logical, her execution was riddled with the errors of someone who'd watched too many crime shows and thought that made her an expert. The latex gloves in the trash, the staged home invasion that was obviously staged, the pond search in response to an obvious trap. Each mistake revealed the fundamental flaw in Darlene's thinking. She believed understanding the theory of crime scene investigation meant she could outsmart actual investigators. She didn't realize that knowing about forensic science and successfully evading it are completely different skills. It's like believing that watching medical dramas makes you qualified to perform surgery.
The beauty queen who thought she was smarter than science wasn't undone by science alone. She was undone by her own psychology. The latex gloves were a mistake any criminal might make in the heat of the moment, but searching the pond, that was pure narcissistic overconfidence. She thought she could outsmart a multi-agency investigation because she'd outsmarted Keith, she'd outsmarted the pageant judges, she'd outsmarted everyone who'd ever underestimated her. But criminal investigation isn't about being underestimated, it's about evidence. And evidence doesn't care about your resume or your beauty or your belief in your own superiority. Evidence just is, and it was everywhere Darlene went. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Darlene had multiple opportunities to stop, to accept that her marriage was ending and find another path forward. But narcissism doesn't allow for acceptance of loss. It doesn't permit the ego injury of being left, of financial failure, of public embarrassment. So rather than face those outcomes, Darlene chose murder. And rather than successfully evade detection, she made every mistake a forensically aware person should have avoided. Because knowing about forensic science isn't the same as understanding it. And understanding it isn't the same as successfully applying it under pressure. And applying it successfully requires the kind of humility and self-awareness that narcissists, by definition, lack. The surveillance footage of Darlene in that pond is now used in law enforcement training, not because it's unusual for killers to return to disposal sites, that's actually common, but because it's a textbook example of how to use a suspect's psychology against them.
Police identified Darlene's narcissistic need for control. They recognized she'd hidden evidence she believed was safe, but would panic if that safety was threatened. They set up a scenario where her own overconfidence would lead her directly into documented criminal behavior, and she walked into it perfectly, because she couldn't imagine that someone had predicted her response. That's the investigative brilliance of this case, not just catching a killer, but using her personality disorder as the trap. Darlene Gentry sits in a Texas prison, serving 60 years for a murder she thought she'd committed perfectly. She had every advantage: medical training, time to plan, a seemingly perfect staged scene. She lost because she believed her own mythology. She thought being a beauty queen meant she could charm her way through suspicion. She thought being a nurse meant she understood forensic science. She thought being intelligent meant she could outwit career investigators. She was wrong on all counts. Because criminal investigation isn't about who's smarter, or more beautiful, or more educated. It's about who makes fewer mistakes. And Darlene made them all.
Subscribe to Zorivox Chronicles, because in the next case file we're examining another killer who thought professional training made them untouchable. The paramedic who used medical knowledge to commit murder and didn't realize that same knowledge would identify the killer. The pattern is always the same. Narcissism plus expertise equals catastrophic overconfidence, and overconfidence leaves evidence.